Hello and welcome to Reach Live. It's 2023, and we're here to again for this year bringing you leaders within digital health. I'm Rena Such. I'm the head of digital and connected health at Ipsos, and my focus is all things digital health and evidence generation, which makes me really excited about the guest that we have on Reach Live today. Susan, welcome to Reach Live, and please give an introduction to yourself.
Yes, thank you so much for having me. I'm Susan Persky. I direct the Immersive Simulation Program and head the Health Communication and Behavior Unit in the Social and Behavioral Research Branch of the National Human Genome Research Institute of the National Institutes of Health. We have a lot of layers in the government. It's always hard to know how far to go, but I think that'll do it. So I am a behavioral scientist, and I study all things related to immersive technologies, genomics, healthcare, health communication, and a variety of other topics that kind of come together in, I think, really interesting ways when it comes to emerging tech and health, and ways that we can leverage our tech to make emerging healthcare options more equitable and more effective.
Incredible. Quite a remit from the genome to the virtual world. You're kind of covering it all.
The whole stack. Yep.
So tell me, what led you first to be interested in this space? I'm kind of intrigued because you're hitting on so many areas which are so important for the future, and we're going to get into applications of that for the future. But what is it for you that led you into this field?
Yeah, I mean, it probably would be more accurate to, or easier to at least say that I study the psychology of emerging tech in a lot of ways,
Mm,
and that translation, because I really started with the immersive technologies early in my career. So I am a social psychologist by training. I went to the University of California, Santa Barbara to get my doctorate degree. And there was this brand new lab environment that was looking at how virtual reality, which was certainly not a thing in the very late 90s when I was coming into the university, but how virtual reality might influence and what it can tell us about ourselves psychologically and interpersonally. So really leveraging VR for social research. My dissertation work back in those days was how using VR to experience and play violent video games might influence us in terms of aggressive behavior and so on. Well before that became an actual relevant thing in society, but conceptually and psychologically, a really, really interesting topic. And once I had finished that work, I had basically this really cool and really powerful tool, in my toolbox of methods that I could use for psychology and public health and other research. And with that in mind, I sort of brought those capacities to the NIH with me. So I started at the NIH in 2005. So I've been there quite a while now. And in 2006, we opened our doors. So we've really had a virtual reality based research lab, which is now called the Immersive Sim Program. It's gone through a couple of names over its lifetime, but we've really been around for quite a while now. And we are applying a lot of these technologies to the big questions that arise when you think about how genetic and genomic technologies are emerging and how they are going to sort of show themselves, in the clinic, because that translation actually tends to happen pretty fast. So these
mm.
new technologies come out, they get adopted, they are available direct to consumers, and we're really interested to see how that will unfold. So in
Mm.
some ways, we started by basically using VR to try and, in some ways predict the future, right? So we would simulate a doctor-patient interaction, inject, some genomics content that wasn't ready to be talked about in the clinic or wasn't ready to be used, but by simulating, either patient or provider and bringing in, sort of a real person to play the other side, we were able to see how those communications and how those
Mm.
recommendations might start to unfold. So that was sort of the early days of leveraging VR tech as basically a research platform or a research tool to do some simulation.
Fascinating. I've played around a little bit with VR in research as well, and there's a lot of difference between the different elements of this area. So we're going to get into a bit of definition and busting stuff. So one is just 360 video, right? Um, and whether you put it into a headset or not, the idea of being immersed in a 360, and you can use the scroller on a laptop or you could be completely immersed. And we did a similar thing where we had a clinician consultation happen, and we asked the individual, because it felt it was in a clinic environment, to put a headset on to see their experience about the dialogue with the clinician and give feedback. Then the next level of that is taking it into a more avatar-based space, right? So the using 3D technology, other imagery technology to kind of create more of an immersive, and that's been used a lot for medical education. So when new molecules are coming, or if we look at the new ways that molecules are interacting, with mRNA being a very clear example of a new technology, which is which really has transformed healthcare. Creating a medical education module within a virtual reality headset was being given to doctors as a way for them to be educated about it. And then I want to take it to augmented reality. This kind of, you're in your real world, but you're putting on glasses or you're putting on some form of immersive tech, and you're being able to see augmented items around you. But less so in healthcare at the minute. I can't think of an example. All I can think of is the IKEA example of me knowing whether my piece of furniture can look like that online.
Yeah.
And then finally, XR, which still needs demystifying, this mixed reality world, which for me is it not AR? So there's me laying it out.
Yep.
Give it to us. How would you give us the layers from your perspective?
I honestly would say this is still weirdly a little bit controversial. But I think there are different ways of breaking it up and different ways of thinking about it. So a lot of people do think of it on that continuum in terms of how much of what you're seeing is digital versus, sort of real world. And so in that sense, more of an augmented reality, seeing if your bookshelf is going to fit. I have actually seen some really nice use cases around sort of surgical planning and around education, and being able to overlay digital content on top of either a real sort of surgical field or a mannequin that you might use in physician training or something like that. So there are, it's up and coming. It's a little harder. The hardware isn't as far along, so there are lots of reasons. But, going from there, and actually, I guess I would argue the continuum starts in real reality. So take that for what you will. But going all the way to a situation where as many of your senses as possible are sort of digitally constructed, right? And so virtual reality would be sort of the poster child for that, because everything you're seeing is digital. And more and more of our senses are able to be sort of drawn into that virtual experience, and sort of envelop us even more. So that would be sort of the other end of the continuum. I mean, you could definitely stick 360 video somewhere in there, because everything at that point, though it was once real, is now digital. And so, for me, a lot of it is just how much are we creating? And, certainly the most action right now is on the virtual reality end, but I think with, technology moving the way it's moving, and, I think different use cases sort of finding their footing in terms of what approach works best, is really going to be when we're hitting those sweet spots. It's not going to be as much about what's easier, what's cheaper, it'd be more about what kinds of applications work better for which outcomes, which is one of the things that, I think is going to be a really important research area as we're moving forward.
So what for you makes you believe that immersive technology is going to scale? Because that's been probably the biggest critique, right? Headset penetration is not the highest of high, and it's mainly in the gaming space. So where do you see that?
Yeah. I mean, a year ago may have said, I don't know, I guess we'll have to see. But I have been to several meetings with folks from the U.S. Veterans Health Association and administration. And they are doing amazing things towards scaling. When you have sort of a coherent, not to say the VA is all coherent, but when you have a place that values innovation, and you have people who are there to make it happen, they are starting to make scaling happen. So, I know that our US health system is very complicated. So, hard to say who's going to be the driver of this, but I think as the technology continues to grow, take new forms, I do think that a movement from sort of telemedicine as it's happening now into the potential to have these things be, far more immersive. Um, I think that's going to become possible. It will, of course, depend on hardware use. But even if that doesn't happen, even if we say, okay, we're done, no more mixed reality, no more augmented reality. I think that the use cases, at least sort of in hospital settings, in the medical system itself, are so appealing that I think those will persist. Even if we're not seeing it wide scale outside of clinical settings, I do think it is showing really important benefits, and we'll probably stay in those kinds of environments in the future.
Just
We're not there yet, obviously.
yeah, and you're right. There's been some compelling evidence. I mean,
Mhm.
pain is one of the most famous clinical. Like there was a randomized controlled trial study, right, which showed the effectiveness of it at
Mhm.
two equivalents of drug therapy. I find the stuff around maternal care, maternal health, maternal care being quite interesting, and mental health, behavioral health is really
Yeah.
big here. So helping people, there's a lot of movement around mindfulness strategies, but also social anxiety like PTSD and elements like that. So
Mhm.
yeah, pain
Yes,
therapy and behavioral
all of
health.
it. Yeah,
Yeah.
I think you've hit upon a lot of the earliest best emerging. I think there were some use cases that emerged early, and
Mm.
that was because it was a slam dunk, right? And so I think a lot of the pain work emerged early with Hunter Hoffman and others out in Washington, and then California. Um, especially Brenda Wiederhold and others have been doing phobia desensitization in VR for ages. Since I've been in the field well over 20 years, and they were already established. When I've joined in, we could say,
Mm.
and I just think because it makes sense to us. I think one of the things as sort of patients and research, for everybody, really, you want to kind of understand the mechanism if you can. And I think those, not to say that we scientifically completely understand the mechanism, but I think people can see it. They can say, okay, if I'm in pain, I know sometimes distraction works. I could see how this might be sort of ultimate distraction. There are other mechanisms now that people are working on, but that was sort of the first easiest, one to go with. And then for phobia desensitization, I mean, yeah, like we're going to put somebody in their environment, but they can be here in the room, and their therapist can be with them, and so I think they just made so much sense. But now I think we're starting to get a little more creative. We're starting to test things out, and there are a lot of other use cases that have arisen with a ton of evidence, around things like rehabilitation. Autism is a big use area now. Especially around training. So I think there are a lot of really amazing emerging uses, but I think there's more to come. I think
Mm.
there's so many creative people out there. The only thing I do always sort of want to, the caveat I always want to give is that, it does tend to be a problem when you approach it as, here's a tool, let's figure out where it works,
Mm.
as opposed to starting with the problem. And I think we're starting to get good at knowing what kinds of problems we can solve with immersive tech. And so, it may be more of a question of looking to our clinical colleagues, our patient friends, and sort of saying, okay, well, what are the problems? And then saying, okay, well, this may not be appropriate, but maybe we can use our creativity and what we know and come up with other solutions as well.
Yeah, we must stay aligned to the need. I agree with you completely. And some of the needs we have are super complex, which is also a big problem within healthcare. But I've also seen some interesting things around helping clinicians, right? These things are not purely a clinician to patient piece, but with the burnout rates and
Yeah.
stress that we're seeing, we've done a number of Reach Live talks with individuals that are looking at sensory forms of technology, so creating an entire room which allows using smell and visuals to kind of help bring blood pressure points down and give people a moment to detach and deal with whatever they're just seeing because they're just working at such a rate. In terms of being at the cusp of seeing as much as you see, where does equity come in? You're someone that speaks to health equity. and you
Yeah.
speak to the importance of it. Yet you're in probably what one would consider right now a very niche space in terms of immersive tech.
Yep.
So, what do you say to that? What's the work that you're putting in, or the team are putting in terms of health equity?
Yeah. Yeah. So I think in terms of health equity, it's really interesting and it's really multifaceted. And I think part of the reason I'm able to address it as much as I am is because I also work in genomics. And genomics is a place with a long history of, yes, problems, and then also people who want to sort of solve those problems, where we've been really, really attuned to equity for, for quite a long while, especially the place where I work. It is really first and foremost. And so I've been able to kind of take those, those lenses, sort of on the emerging tech and apply them sort of across all the work that I do. And so, I think with immersive tech, it's going to be really important because, yes, it is one of the emerging technologies. We know, over and over and over again that access to new technologies is basically never equitable, and that it takes a lot of time, for these things to kind of trickle down in some way. And I think we have a chance. We're early, right? We're early in the ecosystem here, and we have a chance to learn from the past and perhaps try to do a little bit better. So I think I could probably talk about three different ways that I think it's really important to combine, sort of considerations of where the tech is going and how we might be able to use it to make healthcare more equitable and also make its own sort of introduction into healthcare more equitable. So I guess one of the things that is sort of easy to start with, at least, is that the technology itself could benefit us in terms of being able to get more cutting edge treatments out to people, even though providers, are sometimes at a shortage. So being able to use the tech to bring, sort of treatments out to people, who may live in rural areas, who may be underserved. One of the cool things that people don't usually think about with VR is that a lot of the reason that, older populations and others who are potentially less tech savvy might have trouble using some of the digital therapeutics and digital tech that has come before is because they're not particularly user-friendly, or the device that they're on isn't particularly user-friendly. And VR, comes in many flavors, but there are ways to make it very, you open the box, you put it on, you want to do something, you move your arm in the way that you would in the real world to do it. So in a lot of ways, it can absolutely be designed in ways that are very inclusive and are very intuitive to use. It's just that we have to, make sure people are willing and encouraged to design the capabilities in that way. So that's one way I think that, we may be able to actually just help based on the features of the tech itself. Now, beyond that, I think another way that's, maybe a little bit different is that certainly we and others have been using immersive to better understand, where bias, discrimination, these related processes might actually be a problem in healthcare. So I've done a fair amount of research where we can do things, very simply. We make an avatar playing a patient. That virtual human can be white, she can be black, but the sound file, based on what she's going to say, her nonverbal movements, everything else is the same. So in research, what that means is we can know the actual effect of, perceiving somebody's race to be white or black or whatever else you're going to perceive it. We can know that causal effect on the reactions that a doctor might have, for example, in a medical interaction. And there we can start to identify what are the root causes for some of the problems we're seeing, and start to think about ways we might be able to change them. And then, of course, VR is being used for that as well. I've seen a lot of compelling use cases for anti-bias research, or not research even, for anti-bias training. And sort of, the empathy literature on using VR for empathy is, it's pretty mixed, but it has a lot of suggestions about design choices you can make to be able to use VR to effectively, help people, to sort of engender empathy in people. So I think there's a lot of direct uses where we can apply VR and XR more broadly in ways to, study ways to reduce bias, and then also to use it as a tool to do that sort of in and of itself. And then finally, I think, the easy stuff is done, right? So I think, the hard part is that, we probably have seen a lot of the early adopters come in. So I know, with my friends at the VA, the people who are most interested, are the clinics that are tending to use the tech. The patients who are most interested in trying it are the ones who've tried it. Now we have the hard work, right? Now we have to reach out and do the work, make the effort to figure out what the barriers are for other people. Because to some extent, yes, there will always be sort of cost barriers and financial, and access. But in that environment, at least, access isn't as big of a deal. And so who's coming to the table and who's not coming to the table? What are the concerns, and how, I think one of the ideas there is, get the headsets on the heads, right? Because people don't understand VR until they've tried it. And so figuring out ways to do the outreach to make sure that everybody has an opportunity to try it, to decide whether they would like it, whether they think it will work for them. And then also to do the hard research to say, will it work for everybody? We have a history of clinical trials, being historically done on white men for many, many years. And we are now in the clinical trial world just starting to say, okay, we can't do this. Obviously, we need to know if these drugs or, these treatments, for example, will work for everybody. And I think we haven't embraced that yet for clinical trials and VR environments, clinical tools like that. But, I think we have to. Because I think until people try it and until we get everybody at the table, we really won't know sort of the best design choices. We won't know what works for who, how we might tailor, all of those sorts of things.
Completely. No, wow, thank you. You gave a very comprehensive answer to the different elements that are possible, really. And the hard work is now the design with intent, the thinking about our own biases, and getting it. I love the phrase of getting the headset. Much like we used to say about the smartphone, getting the smartphone into people's hands.
Right.
Now it's about getting the headsets on for people to experience it. I mean, there's a lot of delight. There's a lot of videos that show the first time someone's experienced a VR headset or an immersive experience, because it is really like it's quite a wow factor. Very few things in life nowadays can make you give that feeling of like something being wow. And that wonderment is something there needs to be work done to spread that across to people, and campaigning, right? And health literacy is a passion topic for mine. How do we make health accessible? And we're going to have to, with the health system burdened as it is, individuals are seeking valid, credible information and solutions and tools. And I'd love to see more accessibility in every form, people understanding and getting access to information quickly online, and all the way through to having experiential labs where they could go to trial these things. Because that's how people have pivoted in to more tech, is seeing it in their local shopping mall, seeing these things accessible to them for an experience, it tips them in. Yeah. So how are we going to, in terms of, there's two areas now. What are some of the ways that we could be increasing access? And is that down to the health system? Is it also down to technology companies? What's your view on that? And then the second part of it will be the building of evidence, which is something that's very close to your heart. And coming from an academic background and an institute, of course, the more data you have, the more you can inform the future too. So let's start with the accessibility question. Mm-hmm. How do you see access increasing, and whose responsibility is it?
Yeah, I guess access cuts across a bunch of different lines, because there are so many different ways in which the technology can be and will be used in medicine, and so some of it certainly is across the lines of, do you go to a major research hospital, right, for your care? And those are the kinds of places right now, you're more likely to run into these technologies. So part of it is getting it so that it is easy. This is maybe falling more on, well, I'm not going to start talking about standards because standards
Mm.
in VR are everywhere right now. But sort of figuring out implementation wise what works, what's easy, what fits into the routines of medical professionals. Right now the friction is too big. I think to get this sort of all over the place. So I think that is part research, and that's also part sort of design principles and talking to the stakeholders, right, and figuring
Mm.
out what your average healthcare worker who could be using the technology, what does their workflow look like? What do they need? So some of it is just the practicalities of it. Of course, a lot of it will come down to money, and I'm not going to pretend I know how to fix all the money problems we we have in our healthcare, and how to get the newest, best technologies out there. But then the other piece of it, I think, is wellness and the sort of the the things that are important but not really regulated as much and not really as central in the sort of healthcare system. And there, I think it's kind of twofold. In some ways, we almost have too much access. I
Mm.
think we're following some of the problems that we saw in maybe mobile phone apps and others where the stuff that seems to be effective can start to get sort of drowned out amid all of the applications out there that will say that they're for anxiety reduction. Does that mean clinical anxiety, or does that mean just sort of I feel nervous? What does it mean? What is
Yeah.
out there? How can we show that some of these things have actually demonstrated efficacy versus not? It's
Mm.
interesting in the VR landscape because it is more of a closed system right
Yeah.
now. And so I think there's a lot of players and a lot of things to figure out. But I think being able to sort of identify the effective approaches, the effective applications, I think would go a long way. If people could be made aware of what to choose. Otherwise, it's very overwhelming.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
and this is not the solution, but the number of my kids' friends who got Quest 2s for Christmas this year is sort of astounding.
Mm.
Grandparents were busy out there getting their headsets. But there are, now admittedly, more economically advantaged families, but there are a lot of headsets out there. They're just, people don't know what the options are for using those headsets. If they could say, okay,
Mm.
well, why don't I take my kid's headset and use it, to do some meditation or to address my chronic pain, that's starting to become a possibility. But, part of that is sort of spreading the word and getting, some of those applications that work accessible and sort of highlighted, I suppose, as a possibility. So, that's even another way in which we probably need to think about access as well.
Mm. Yeah. I love this vision of a younger part of the family who's really into it, passing it on to some other person, and them not, the youngsters kind of really moving it up the chain and getting everyone to have an experience. Because that is
Yeah.
really how people do dip into to trying new
Yes.
things.
Yeah. That's a wonderful way to do it.
Yeah.
Um, a lot of people I talk to, when they hear that I work with the technology, they're like, "Oh, my kid has one," or like, my kid's friends have one, but I've never tried it. Well, you
Mm.
should. Why? Why would you not? And then let's talk about how it may actually be useful in your life.
Yeah. And then the evidence generation piece, which I think will help the clinical community also come up the ranks, right? Because we do all love a bit of clinical trial data of journal articles. So what do you feel about that? Do you feel there's enough being done to create appropriately diverse clinical trials across demographic, age groups, what have you? So what's the situation from completely your perspective?
Yeah, yeah. I think never enough.
Mhm.
Well, I think that things are definitely taking off as far as rigorous clinical trials go. I think for a long time we kind of sat back and said, well, it's so new, it's so new. We're just gonna do a trial on 30 people. We'll ask them how they feel before and after, and we have data. And I think we're to the point now where I think we can kind of safely say, like, that was fine, but now we really need to do rigorous clinical trials and really understand the effect of these technologies. And it's okay if they're not more effective than established approaches. I mean, that's great. If they're the same effectiveness, that would be wonderful, because there's other features that, they're non-invasive, they're non-pharmacological. They have all sorts of things going for them. But I think clinical trials are expensive. They're a high bar. So I think we really are pretty early to the world of, very rigorous, well-powered clinical trials with, sort of serious control groups or serious comparator groups to compare the VR applications against. However, what I've seen coming out has been, really encouraging, and I think there's something to all the positive findings that have happened, in the last 5-7 years. They're not coming out of nowhere. It's just that, we don't have the kind of rigorous evidence we would really need in a lot of cases yet. And, as we're talking, the populations on whom a lot of these things have been tested are, they tend to be convenience populations, right? They're whoever's coming already to your academic medical center, which is not a representative slice of the population. So really having to work a little harder to diversify our participant pools, and sort of make sure that things are working sort of across demographic groups and so on, I think is going to be really critical coming up. And it is a requirement in a lot of areas for clinical trials, and there's no reason, it shouldn't be a requirement here as well. So, I think as people are working on standards and, the recommended approaches for evidence generation, I think it's a really important facet of that.
Yeah, just been thinking about this as we've been doing having this conversation, and the other thing that I think is really important around technology and just treatment overall is as we move to a future which one hopes is personalized, right? That is driven by the uniqueness of me, by my biological makeup, by my background, by my education level, my choice set. I think we also need to move away from everything being for everyone. This is an effective form of therapy. I mean, I've seen it. I've seen what it could do for like pain management, for example, for a period of time, the relief it can give. So it is effective in certain disciplines, in certain moments. And I think we need to work more to the point of who is it right for by doing a lot more diverse sets of tests across different demographics with different questions based on need, like circling back to the beginning, based on, and then offering it as a suite of a solution because it is there to help and support individuals, right? And your world of genomics and immersive tech is just so fascinating to me because the future is personal. The future has to be personal. I mean, I'm fighting for that now, but I'm privileged. I'm privileged because I have choice. So tell me more about, these will be your parting words for today as we wrap live today because we're coming close to time. So for you, rather than talk about the future of VR, because it still is nascent and moving, immersive tech is still moving, but how will we get to a more personalized health future? What's your vision and hope for that?
Yeah, I mean, I think, ultimately it's the ability to harmonize and have sort of data streams talk to each other in some ways, because there are so many facets of me, of you, that could be informing the right treatment for us. And some of that certainly, may very well be genetic. Some of it might just be, sort of our biomarker response to different nutrition, to, pharmaceuticals, whatever. But a lot of it is also our mindset. Placebo effect, very effective, right? Do we think it's going to work? That's a very obvious one, but there are all kinds of other sort of orientations towards treatment and technology, and why we think, what's our mental model of why, we are affected by, whatever health conditions we might be affected by. So there are just so many facets that could feed into these models. And, we've been pinning our hopes on genetics for a really long time. It hasn't borne out in the way I think any of us hoped it would. It could still. But, it's sort of, we've got to look beyond sort of the usual suspects in a lot of ways. And, VR itself, when you use it, generates a lot of data, right? And so we are constantly our movement, 60, 90 times a second is being captured. And there's a lot of things somebody could do with that movement data, a lot of potential problems that, we can talk about another day, but there's a lot of great stuff. We can gather from somebody's walking path in a VR environment to tell about their health. So there's just so many ways that data can be captured and fed back in. So I think a lot of it is sort of infrastructure and logistics and technology related, but people are working really hard on these issues. So I'm kind of hoping we might be able to make ourselves a really robust digital twin one day, and sort of capture and integrate all of these different important streams of data.
Yeah, I'm with you. I think it will happen. And some of the technology we've seen already around digital twins is fascinating, and it can only get better and more accurate. So thank you so much. Thank you for being with us on Reach Live. And big thank you to everyone that joined us. As always, please subscribe. We are on YouTube, it's on LinkedIn, and I'm sure other forums too. So please be sure to follow Reach Live, be a subscriber, and we'll be back next month with another wonderful digital health speaker. Thank you so much.